They laughed when she inherited a car graveyard, said it was worthless, just rows of rusted metal and old ghosts baking under the Wyoming sun. But they didn't know the truth hidden beneath the dust. Because inside Red Hollow Salvage Yard were stories. Stories of survival, of second chances, of people who disappeared and were never meant to be found again. What she uncovered will leave you speechless, and by the end, it just might break your heart in the most beautiful way. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. The old Jeep Wrangler rattled its way up the final stretch of gravel road, every bump echoing through the silence like a drumbeat from the past. Behind the wheel sat Margot Sinclair, a woman in her early 40s with a quiet resilience carved into the lines around her eyes. Her auburn hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her flannel shirt hung loose over denim overalls, clothes chosen for function, not fashion. As the last tree gave way to open space, a rusted sea of abandoned vehicles stretched out before her, swallowed by tall grass and years of neglect. This was Red Hollow Salvage Yard, a forgotten plot of land tucked in the fog-drenched hills of Wyoming Ridge, a place where time had clearly decided to stop. Rows upon rows of car husks, Chevys, Buicks, trucks with broken windows and missing doors, all coated in a film of rust and silence. Margot hadn't been here since she was a child, and now it was hers. People laughed when the lawyer called. A graveyard of junk, they scoffed, nothing but scrap metal and old ghosts. But as the wind whispered through the dented fenders and shattered glass, Margot felt something stir deep in her chest. Something that felt a lot like coming home. Margot Sinclair stepped out of the Jeep, her boots crunching softly on the gravel as a gust of cold mountain air swept across the open yard. The silence was complete, broken only by the distant creak of rusted metal swaying in the breeze. She pulled her flannel shirt tighter around her and took a slow breath, tasting the air oil, pine, and a faint sweetness she couldn't quite name. This place had once belonged to her grandfather, a gruff man with calloused hands and a heart that only softened for old engines and stray dogs. She hadn't seen him since she was 12. The news of his death came with a legal letter, cold and formal. He'd left her everything. A graveyard of forgotten machines. They'd laughed her co-workers at the diner, her ex-husband over the phone. "You gonna sell it for scrap or live in a truck bed?" he'd sneered. But Margot didn't laugh. She remembered how it felt to sit in his lap as he steered a rust-bitten Ford through the woods behind the yard. She remembered the smell of motor oil and cherry tobacco, the way he whistled low when he was deep in thought. She remembered feeling safe. Now, walking between the hulking corpses of cars, she didn't feel crazy for coming. She felt guided. The salvage yard was bigger than she remembered. Time had stretched it. Metal vines of exhaust pipes and bumpers wove through the tall grass like bones. Some of the cars had trees growing through their frames. Others were sunken halfway into the earth, like they'd given up trying to be seen. She reached the old trailer office where her grandfather used to keep the records, or, as he called them, the stories. The door creaked on its hinges as she pushed it open. Dust swirled in the amber light. Everything was as it had been frozen in time mugs still on the shelf. A dusty radio perched next to a worn ledger. And photos. So many photos pinned to the wall. She stepped closer. Snapshots of smiling faces, kids holding up greasy hands, couples posing in front of restored muscle cars, a young soldier in uniform shaking her grandfather's hand in front of a Jeep with thanks. Hank spray-painted on the hood. These weren't customers. They were lives. People her grandfather had helped. The office smelled like diesel and paper, and something older, something warm. On the desk was a single envelope with her name written in sharp block letters. Margot. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter inside was short, but heavy with the weight of decades. Kid, if you're reading this, I guess the rust finally won. I know this place doesn't look like much, but it's got soul. Every car here came with a story. Some broken, some lost, some running from things they didn't have words for. I fixed what I could, but there are still some left behind. You've always had the heart for this, even when you didn't know it. There's one that matters, out back under the tarps, the blue '68 Plymouth. She's waiting. Grandpa Hank. Margot let out a shaky breath. Something in her chest cracked a little. She folded the letter, tucked it into her jacket, and turned toward the back of the yard. It took nearly 10 minutes to find it, a tarp-covered shape tucked beneath a collapsed awning, hidden behind a wall of pickup beds and rusted axles. She pulled the tarp free slowly, the fabric stiff and frayed. The blue shone faintly under the grime. It was a 1968 Plymouth Satellite Heavy. Classic lines, her grandfather's favorite. She walked around it slowly, running her hand along the cool metal. Then she stopped. The passenger side door had been repainted not well. Uneven strokes, a different shade of blue. She leaned closer. Scratched into the faded paint, barely visible in the right light, were 3 names. Elsie, Marcus, Baby J. Not carved like graffiti, these were etched with care. She opened the door. The seat was intact, the dashboard dusty but untouched. In the glove box was a sealed plastic bag. Inside, a photograph of a woman, a man, and a toddler standing beside this very car, smiles full of hope. There was also a note, yellowed with time. We're heading north, thank you. Hank, you saved our lives. Margot pressed the photo to her chest. The yard wasn't just a business. It had been a lifeline, a shelter for those running from something, maybe abuse, maybe poverty, maybe just nowhere left to go. And her grandfather. He hadn't been a hermit. He'd been a quiet savior. She looked out across the field of broken cars. They weren't just metal. They were monuments. And now, the mission was hers. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Margot Sinclair found herself outside again, clutching a thermos of black coffee and staring at the blue '68 Plymouth like it might speak. The fog had settled low and heavy over Red Hollow, swallowing the tops of the rusted car stacks in a misty hush. She hadn't slept. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Who were Elsie, Marcus, and Baby J? Why had they needed saving? Why her grandfather? The car wasn't just a relic, it was a message, a key to something deeper. She opened the trunk on instinct. It creaked but lifted. Inside, beneath a folded tarp and a spare tire, was a metal box. Plain. Locked. Heavy. Margot swallowed. Her grandfather had been old-school, no digital anything. No passwords, just keys and locks and faith in his own hands. She remembered how he used to keep a coffee can full of keys above the old workshop bench. 10 minutes later, she found it. The can was still there, and inside, dozens of unlabeled keys jingled like bones. She took them all. Back at the trunk, kneeling on gravel, she worked through them one by one until the 12th key clicked. The box opened. Inside papers. Folded carefully. A thick manila envelope labeled "Emergency Only." A small stack of photographs, aged and creased, each with names scribbled on the back, families, individuals, all standing near recognizable vehicles in the yard. But one photo stopped her cold. It was her grandfather, standing beside a teenage girl with a black eye and a suitcase. On the back, in her grandfather's bold writing, Claire Whitmore, July 1994. Safe. Margot sat back, heart pounding. Suddenly, everything shifted. This yard hadn't just been a safe haven. It had been an underground network, a place for escape. Quiet, off the grid. Her grandfather, the man who smelled of motor oil and didn't say much, had been hiding people in plain sight. The envelope held a list of names and dates, each with a note to Kansas, sister's house, needs new plates, kid allergic to penicillin, keep record, and next to some names, a simple, heartbreaking word, returned. Returned. As she read, the sound of tires crunching on gravel jolted her. She stood quickly and saw a truck approaching a dark gray pickup with tinted windows. It wasn't familiar. Her grip tightened on the metal box as the truck rolled to a stop just outside the gate. A man stepped out, late 50s, maybe early 60s, gray beard, sun-worn skin, boots caked with dried mud. He looked like someone who belonged in a different kind of story, the kind told in hushed tones over diner counters. He didn't smile, didn't approach right away, just looked around the yard. Slowly, like it was a dream he hadn't dared revisit. "You're Hank's girl?" he asked, voice raspy like gravel underfoot. Margot nodded cautiously. "Granddaughter. He passed a few months ago." The man nodded once. "Figured. I'm Ray Boone." He looked past her, towards the blue Plymouth. He said, if anything ever happened to him, I should come by. Just in case. Margot hesitated. Just in case of what? Ray stepped forward, pulling a worn photo from his coat pocket. He handed it to her. It was the same photo she'd just seen the girl with the black eye. "Claire. She's my niece," he said softly. "Disappeared when she was 17. Cops said she ran off with some boyfriend. But I knew better. Her stepdad was a piece of work. Hank got her out. We never heard from her again. But he told me. She made it." Margot felt tears sting unexpectedly. She showed him the picture she'd found in the box. Ray stared at it like it might vanish if he blinked. "She got out. She whispered." Ray swallowed hard. "Thank God." He looked up at her. "Did he leave a record? A-list?" She handed him the manila envelope. "It's all here. Names, places, I think your uncle helped more people than anyone ever realized." Ray looked around the yard again, the emotion swelling in his face, but he kept it pressed down. "They'll want to know. You know. The others. I ain't the only one who never stopped wondering." Margot nodded slowly. She was no longer standing in a graveyard. She was standing in a sanctuary, a place filled with second chances, buried beneath rust and silence. And now, the stories needed to be told. That night, Margot couldn't sleep. She sat at the edge of her grandfather's trailer, the porch light casting a warm amber glow across the junkyard. No, not a junkyard anymore. Not to her. It was something else now. Something sacred. The box lay open beside her, documents fanned out like pages from a forgotten history book. The names, the photographs, the whispered stories of escape, they weren't just pieces of a puzzle. They were acts of defiance, buried under chrome and weeds. Ray Boone had left hours ago, promising to make some calls. There were others like him, people who had held on to questions for decades. Now, Margot had the answers. She stared out into the dark, where headlights had once flickered in under cover of night, where people with no other options had found refuge. Her grandfather had never told anyone, not even her mother. He'd carried this secret to his grave, and somehow he'd known she would be the one to uncover it. The next morning, Margot pulled the heavy chain from the front gate and swung it open wide. She didn't know why. Exactly, maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was hope, but something told her it was time to stop hiding. She brewed coffee, swept the dust from the old office, and laid the photos out on the desk like exhibits in a museum. For the first time, she looked at each face, really looked. There was pain, yes, but also relief, gratitude, life. Around mid-morning, the first car rolled in. An old Subaru, paint faded, front bumper held on with duct tape. A woman stepped out. She was in her late 40s, with wind-chapped cheeks and eyes that had seen too much. She held a photograph in her hand. "You Margot?" she asked. Margot nodded. "Can I help you?" The woman handed her the photo. It was one of the snapshots from the box, a young boy standing beside a red station wagon, holding a stuffed bear. The woman pointed to the child. "That's my brother. I haven't seen him since I was 12. I found a post online someone mentioned your grandfather, said he helped people." Margot's breath caught. She motioned the woman inside and laid out the photos. Within minutes, they found a match, a different shot of the same boy, slightly older, smiling beside the Plymouth. The woman's hands shook. "I knew it. I knew he didn't just vanish. He was taken away for a reason." Her voice cracked. He was safe. By noon, 3 more people had arrived. Word was spreading through social media. Whispers, private messages in dusty forums where cold cases still haunted people's hearts. They came with photos, questions, letters half-written and never sent. One by one, Margot welcomed them. One by one, they found pieces of closure. By the end of the week, the old office was full. Ray Boone returned with his niece Claire Whitmore, no longer the broken teenager in the photograph. Now a social worker in Oregon, Claire brought with her a list of others who had been sheltered, saved, and gone on to live quietly, anonymously, gratefully. But Claire didn't come just to say thank you. She came with a request. "You have something here. Margot," she said. Voice calm but resolute. Not just a yard full of memories, a sanctuary. And there are still people out there who need what this place once was. Margot looked at her. "You mean, reopen it?" "Not as a salvage yard," Claire replied. "As a refuge, a transitional space. Quiet, off-grid. Like your grandfather made it, but this time, with protection, with backing, with purpose." Margot felt her breath catch. The idea was enormous, terrifying, beautiful. That night, she walked the perimeter of the yard under the light of a pale moon. She stopped beside the Plymouth, placed her hand on its roof, and closed her eyes. She could almost hear him, her grandfather's steady voice, the gentle clink of tools, the low rumble of the old AM radio playing Johnny Cash. "You've always had the heart for this." He'd written. She understood now, not just the secret he'd left behind, but the reason he'd left it for her. He knew she'd been broken, too. Her marriage had crumbled. Her savings were gone. Her friends had thinned out like fall leaves. She had nothing when she arrived here, except space, silence, and an aching need for something real. And now she had a mission. Within a month, Red Hollow Salvage had become the Sinclair Foundation, a non-profit registered in Margot's name, funded through small donations from the very families her grandfather had once protected. Ray Boone became the head of security. Claire Whitmore, the operations coordinator. They restored the office, reinforced the yard's perimeter, and converted one of the trailers into a warm, private intake room. Every car left untouched was left for a reason, and now they served as monuments, silent sentinels to the second chances born on these grounds. People came, quietly, carefully. Women fleeing abuse, Veterans wrestling invisible wounds, teens who'd aged out of broken systems. They didn't stay long, just long enough to find their footing. Just like the people before them. Just like her. One evening, as the autumn chill crept in, and the first flakes of snow dusted the hoods of the old vehicles, Margot sat beside a campfire ring they had built near the center of the yard. Kneeling beside her was a young girl named Tessa, maybe 17, newly arrived. Quiet as the wind. She watched the flames with guarded eyes, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Margot poured her a mug of hot cocoa and handed it over. "You know," she said gently, "every car here has a name. Not the model, I mean the people who rode in them, the ones who got away. This one here." She nodded toward a sunken Cadillac. "That was Marcus and Elsie. And Baby Jay." Tessa's lips twitched. "You're making that up?" Margot smiled softly. "Nope. Found their names scratched in the paint. They left in the middle of the night. Drove north. Sent a postcard 3 years later from Nova Scotia. Still have it in the office." Tessa sipped her cocoa, eyes narrowing in curiosity. Did they make it? Margot looked out into the yard, at the stars beginning to pierce through the clouds above the mountains. "They made it," she whispered. And now, so would Tessa. The snow came early that year. Red Hollow was blanketed in white by late October, turning the skeletons of old cars into soft, glistening silhouettes. Where rust had once screamed of decay, snow now whispered of silence. Peace, a quiet rebirth. Margot Sinclair stepped out of the office trailer with a mug of cinnamon tea in her gloved hands, her breath fogging the air in soft clouds. She gazed across the yard, or what used to be a yard. What once was a dumping ground for forgotten steel had transformed into something alive. The Sinclair Foundation was no longer just an idea whispered over campfires and coffee mugs. It was real. Solar panels lined the roof of the main trailer now, installed by a pair of brothers who'd once stayed here for 2 months before heading west to start their own business. A greenhouse cobbled together from scavenged windows and spare frames stood behind the old bus shell, growing winter spinach and carrots under heat lamps powered by a whisper-quiet generator. The Cadillac where Marcus, Elsie, and Baby Jay had once slept had become a memorial, its doors welded shut, its interior preserved with care. A brass plaque now read, "To those who drove toward hope." It had started with stories. Now it had structure. Margot sat down at the newly restored wooden desk in the office. The wood had been sanded, stained, polished. The drawers no longer stuck, and the heater hummed softly beneath her feet. Claire Whitmore entered, cheeks pink from the cold, a clipboard under one arm. "Big day," Claire said, brushing snow from her shoulders. "Another one." Margot smiled, sipping her tea. Claire raised a brow. "We're finalizing the transportation grants. If it comes through, we'll be able to bring in up to 12 families next quarter. From out of state." 12, Margot echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded. "You built something. Margot, something that matters. People see that." Margot looked at the wall behind the desk. Dozens of photos were pinned there, now not of rusted vehicles, but of faces. Some smiling, some solemn. All changed. They were people who had passed through Red Hollow with nowhere else to go, and left with something they never expected to find. Safety. Direction. Home. Later that afternoon, a knock sounded on the door. Ray Boone stood outside, bundled in a heavy coat, holding a letter. His beard was frosted, and Kaiser, the rescue dog they'd taken in 3 weeks ago, stood loyally by his side, tail wagging slowly. "This came in the box," Ray said, handing her the envelope. "No return address. Margot opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note on weathered paper. The penmanship shaky, but legible. Dear Miss Sinclair, I don't know if you remember me. My name's Jonah. Back in '97, I was the dumb kid who came through with a stolen guitar and a busted hand. Your grandfather let me stay for 2 weeks. He fed me, fixed my hand, and gave me a second-hand coat I still wear to this day. I've been clean for 12 years. I've got a wife, a little girl named Daisy, and I teach music at a middle school in Ohio. I heard what you're doing. I just wanted to say, thank you. You're keeping the engine running. Jonah B. Margot blinked rapidly and folded the letter. Sometimes the past whispered. Sometimes it reached across decades with arms full of grace. That evening, they lit a fire in the new gathering pit, a circle of repurposed truck rims and bricks that had become the unofficial heart of the foundation. Tessa sat beside Margot again, bundled in a thrifted coat and holding a steaming bowl of soup. You think they'll let me help in the greenhouse tomorrow? She asked, her voice steadier than before. I think you'll be running the greenhouse by spring, Margot said, nudging her shoulder gently. Across from them, Ray was teaching a young boy how to split kindling, while Claire read aloud from an old journal they'd found tucked inside the glove box of a Ford Fairlane. The yard was full of life, of laughter, of healing, and for the first time in a long time, Margot felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. She looked up at the stars peeking through the thinning clouds. The world outside might never understand the power of what they were building here. They might still call it a salvage yard, a pile of junk, a place with no future. But Margot knew the truth. Hope doesn't always look like glass towers and perfect plans. Sometimes, it looks like rusted metal, snow-covered roofs, and the warm eyes of someone who's been given a second chance. And sometimes, it begins with a letter, and a girl crazy enough to answer it. The day started with wind. Not just a breeze, but the kind of wind that seemed to pull at the bones of the land, rattling old hubcaps, whispering through cracked windshields, and whistling low like a memory trying to break free. Margot Sinclair stood on the roof of the greenhouse, securing a loose panel before the storm came in. Her gloves were stiff with cold, her eyes focused, but her mind was somewhere else. It was the anniversary. 1 year since she'd inherited the salvage yard. 1 year since she'd stepped into a life she never imagined and found a version of herself she thought was long gone capable, compassionate, whole. But no one had told her that healing other people would sometimes reopen your own wounds. Back in the office, a small package waited for her on the desk. No name, no return address, just "To Margot" scrawled across the top in black marker. Inside was a tiny red Matchbox car, a '68 Plymouth. Identical to the real one outside the car where Marcus and Elsie and Baby J had hidden their hopes, scratched their names, and driven away toward freedom. Under the toy car was a folded note. My name is James. I don't expect you to remember me. I was Baby J. My parents told me about your grandfather. They've both passed now, but I found the photo. And I found you. Thank you for saving their lives. I'm bringing my daughter to visit. I want her to see where hope begins. Margot clutched the note to her chest, the tears coming before she could even brace for them. She wasn't ready for this kind of gratitude. It came like a wave, sudden, undeniable, and too big to hold. She had done nothing more than open a gate, but somehow she had become the keeper of their stories. James and his daughter, Nina, arrived the next day. He was taller than she expected, with kind eyes and a calm voice, the kind of calm that only comes from surviving something. Nina was no more than 6, with springy curls and a face full of curiosity. She walked the yard like she was stepping into a fairy tale. When they reached the Cadillac monument, James froze. He traced the brass plaque with his fingers. Margot watched his throat tighten. She was pregnant when they left, he said quietly, barely showing. They didn't even know if they'd make it past the state line. He looked down at Nina. But they did. Because someone believed they deserved to try. Margot crouched beside the girl. "Do you know why your name is Nina?" The child shook her head. "Your grandmother's middle name," James said, tears slipping down his cheeks. "My mother named you after the woman she wanted to become." That evening, the wind calmed just long enough for everyone to gather around the fire pit. James told the story of how his parents escaped, how they'd been on the run from more than just poverty. There had been violence, fear, and a man they refused to name. Hank didn't ask questions. James said, his voice cracking. He handed them keys. He gave them a map. He hugged my mom before she left and told her, "You go north, and you don't look back." Silence fell over the fire. Even Kaiser, usually restless, lay still. Then Nina reached into her pocket and pulled out the Matchbox car. She placed it on the ground between them all. "My grandpa gave this to me," she said, softly. "He said it was magic." Ray Boone, who'd been silent the whole time, reached over and nudged the car with one calloused finger. He wasn't wrong, kiddo. After they left, Margot sat alone by the Cadillac. The stars overhead blinked through the passing clouds, and the metal of the old cars shimmered faintly with frost. Her breath came slow, and she felt her heart ache not from pain, but from the beautiful, unbearable weight of purpose. She thought about the version of herself who had arrived here 1 year ago, lost, bitter, and alone. And now she was none of those things. She was still healing, still human. But she was found. Later, as she closed the office for the night, she paused by the old rotary phone mounted on the wall, her grandfather's. She lifted the receiver and placed it to her ear. There was no dial tone. She didn't need one. "Hey, Grandpa?" she whispered. She looked around at the photos, the names, the walls that had once held only rust and silence, and now carried the heartbeat of 100 second chances. "I kept it going," she said. "You passed the torch and I didn't drop it." She smiled through her tears. "I'm still running the engine." It happened on a Thursday morning. The sky was soft and blue. The kind of blue that made you believe, just for a moment, that the world might actually be okay. Margot Sinclair stood at the top of the ridge, overlooking the land that once made her feel small. Below her, the cars sat in their quiet, rusted rows, no longer symbols of decay, but of resilience. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood 27 people, some old, some young, some with tired eyes, others with brand new hope pulsing just beneath the surface. They were survivors, wanderers, souls who had passed through this strange sanctuary and left different than they came. And today, they had all returned. Claire Whitmore had suggested it. A reunion, she'd said, something to honor what's been built, what's still building. Ray called it the homecoming. Tessa called it the beginning. Margot didn't know what to call it, only that when she saw James arrive, hand in hand with little Nina, and when she saw the brothers from New Mexico and the girl with the violin who used to flinch at every sudden sound, something in her chest cracked wide open. They were here. They remembered. They gathered around the old Cadillac, the memorial, where a new plaque had been added just that morning. Margot ran her hand over the words. To the ones who stayed, to the ones who left, to the ones who survived, and the ones who made survival possible. No one spoke for a long time. Then Claire stepped forward, holding a folded piece of paper in her hands. She looked at Margot. "May I?" Margot nodded. Claire unfolded the letter, worn, faded, smudged in the corners. It's the first thing Hank ever wrote to someone he helped. It was never mailed. I found it in the glove box of an old Ford. She cleared her throat and red. You don't have to be fixed to be worthy. You don't have to be healed to be welcome. You just have to be willing to keep going. And when you can't, I'll help you remember how—" Claire looked up, her voice breaking. I think that was his way of saying, "You're not alone." A few quiet tears rolled. Margot didn't hide hers. This wasn't a ceremony. This was a full-circle moment. Later that afternoon, they shared stories. Around the fire pit, on rusted bumpers, leaning against hoodless trucks and cracked leather seats. They told tales of second chances, of finding jobs, of getting clean, of choosing to live. Nina ran through the rows of cars with Tessa chasing behind her, giggling. Free. Ray grilled hot dogs while telling old trucker jokes that made even the grimmest faces smile. And Margot? She just stood still, absorbing the miracle of it all. She wandered later, alone, past the bus where the greenhouse now grew herbs and tomatoes, past the rows of tires stacked like columns of some ancient temple. She ended up back at the Plymouth, the car that had started it all. The metal was colder now. The letters, Elsie, Marcus, Baby J, were barely visible beneath the clear sealant they'd added to protect the carving. But the meaning hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened. As the sun began to sink and the sky turned a warm honey gold, Margot returned to the gathering. Tessa handed her a guitar. "We thought maybe you'd say something." Margot held it for a moment, uncertain. Then sat down. She didn't know a song, but she knew a story. Her voice was soft at first. "I came here a year ago," she began, thinking I was inheriting a yard full of broken things. She looked around. But they weren't cars." A quiet laugh rippled through the crowd. Bittersweet. Knowing. "I was broken," she said. "I didn't know it yet. But I was. And this place, this graveyard, it didn't fix me." She smiled, her voice catching. "It let me fix other people first. And in doing that, it gave me back to myself." Silence. Then applause, not the loud, thunderous kind, but the kind that starts slow, from the chest, the kind that feels like love. That night, as stars bloomed overhead and the last embers of the fire glowed, Margot sat beside Claire, Ray, and Tessa, her hands wrapped around a cup of cocoa. She looked up at the dark sky and whispered, "I get it now, Grandpa. Ray hurt her. What's that?" Margot smiled through her tears. "Why you never stopped. Why you never said a word. This wasn't about being seen." She looked out across the field at the glowing trailers, the laughter, the lights flickering through the fog. This was about making sure someone else could be. Margot Sinclair didn't just inherit a car graveyard. She inherited a chance to carry forward a quiet legacy of kindness. Her grandfather, Hank, didn't save the world with noise or glory. He saved it one runaway, one scared mother, one lost teenager at a time in silence, without thanks. The greatest acts of love are often the ones no one sees. Her story isn't about rescuing others. It's about becoming someone who believes that broken people still deserve to be safe. And that, maybe, we can be the place where hope begins again. The woman who once arrived with nothing but pain and a key to a junkyard had become the keeper of a sanctuary that said yes to those the world gave up on. Because for Margot and for those who follow, broken things aren't meant to be thrown away. They're meant to be rebuilt with love. The end? Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep believing in the good, and hit subscribe if you believe no one is ever too lost to start over.